All right, we're going to do a little bit of a review here for the left side of the lesson 8.2 and the New Deal programs that are there, 15 of them. You should be able to categorize them with that visual I provided with you there. And those are the most important, especially the ones that are in the reform category. But they're all important. You possibly could see a lot of those on an EOC exam or winter interim. The examples of what they look like, of course, loans to businesses, benefits for the unemployed and jobless, assistance to the aged and sick, the government creating lots of jobs, especially star on this one, putting people back to work was the primary focus of his speech. We got to get people working. There's huge unemployment, public community projects, various programs doing that. But how is it that we get Americans and people to understand how this works to be supportive of it, to understand the concept behind it? Most people, especially in rural America, probably only had an eighth grade education in about this time. Of my grandparents, I had one that graduated from high school. You need to be able to explain this stuff in simple terms. People understand supply and demand, basic things like that. But in terms of all this federal involvement and regulation and things of that nature, what's going on, it's maybe a little more complicated. So he's going to pitch the idea and use the slogan, the phrase, prime the economic pump. The economy is going to be compared to that pump that you see there. It's an old-fashioned pump that has a pipe going down into the ground, drawing out water. Everybody understands how it works. Rich or poor at that time, but the pump has gone dry. Inside that pump, there is a leather gasket that touches the inside of that pump if it is flush with water, all right? As water touches it, it expands and it connects to the side or touches the side of the pump. And as you pump the handle, it draws or creates suction from below, pulling the water up and out from below. But our economic pump, or the gasket, the lettered gasket in there, our pocketbooks, business, banks are running dry of money. It's not flowing anymore. People don't have it. There's too much debt, for example, is one cause, right? There's not enough money to be spent. And so the idea here is we're going to prime the pump by massively putting money or water into it to get money out. And it's really dry, so it's going to take a lot of money and big programs, big spending to get all this circulating again. Again, running water in rural America and electricity for that matter wasn't necessarily all that common in a lot of places. And so this is what's going to be used. And of course, it's going to be conveyed through dozens and dozens of fireside chats with focus on specific problems and specific programs. On the left-hand side, Hoover did some of that, but FDR and the Democrats are going to do a lot more of that. And on the right side there's a little bit of a criticism as to the effectiveness of that program, right? It's leaky. It's going to be criticized as wasteful, too much, heavy burdens on the taxpayers. That guy's really working hard bringing that water up the hill there. And by priming the pump, you pour water in, let it contact that gasket, and it expands. And then as you pump, you keep drawing, and naturally it goes around and around again. So it's kind of like a kickstart to the economy here is what's supposed to happen here. This is your left-hand side for the notes on what we're going to talk about here today. And of course, we worked on that and talked about some of those critics, mostly on the liberal side, but some on the conservative side as to what they saw in the New Deal. All right, but the election of 1936 is the second term in office here and second run for a second term in office by FDR. And the Republicans have this guy by the name of Alfred Landon who says, of course, the New Deal is radical, it's experimentation, it's confusing, there's all kinds of acronyms, and it's frightfully wasteful. This is no time for donkey business. What the Democrats are doing is like monkey business, but it's donkey business. We need a Republican for that. It takes an elephant to get us out of the mud here with that one. But the results are a even bigger landslide than 1932. The Democrats have now a 2/3 majority in both houses. And so this was a mandate for Democrats and especially for Roosevelt, a message that people are in favor of what he's doing and they want more, right, of what's going on. But in that, the lead up and run up to that election, many of FDR's New Deal cases or programs for that, for example, cases were declared unconstitutional. One of them that we need to know about is called the sick chicken case, the Schechter Poultry Company versus the United States. And it was centered on the way in which something called the National Industrial Recovery Act worked. Right? This was supposed to create an alliance of industries, get industries together, have them sit down at a table and come up with self-regulating codes. This was meant to hopefully avoid the need for antitrust laws and the federal government having to regulate business and industries. Let them self-regulate. Well, how do they do that? They come with agreements about how much they're going to pay their workers, for example, in the auto industry or in some sort of an industry of whatever type, the prices they're going to charge for their goods, how much they're going to produce in a given year, things like that. And they had to come up with some protections for workers and come up with codes as to how they treat their workers, things of that nature. Unionization wasn't necessarily required in it, but that's what they were talking about. And when they got that together, then they were going to present it to the president, and it would be approved by FDR, and it would become essentially law for that industry. And those industries and those businesses that were a part of that agreement would be required to fly this sign that had the blue eagle in there that said, "We do our part. We're working together for the benefit of everybody." Now, it went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court basically rules that Congress cannot, and what they did was delegate too much of their legislative authority to the president or the executive branch by establishing these codes or letting him establish these codes and approve these codes for industry. The Congress should do that. The Constitution itself, they ruled, says that interstate commerce, buying and selling goods between state lines, which all these businesses that we're talking about here are doing, is supposed to be regulated in the sole power of Congress, not the president. And so they need to be the ones that come up with those things. And so it's unconstitutional in that it gave up too much local control and power making, rule making, legislative powers to the president. It was dead. Now, many of these programs that are declared unconstitutional, many of them are going to come back as new laws and be rewritten. One of those is the Agricultural Adjustment Act, the AAA program. This is really important to also to understand as well. There was a lot of food in the country, but the problem was, as you saw in his speech, the supply of getting it to people was a problem. There was also an oversupply. Remember, our farmers have price problems because partly there is just too much of everything, too much of every type of grain and food and so on and so forth. The government actually destroyed some crops and some agricultural goods to bring down the supply, which would bring up the price. And that didn't sit well with some people, right? It wasn't hugely widespread, but it was there enough for people to notice and criticize it. It didn't make sense when people were going hungry in places and going without. But what this is going to do, and this is really important to understand because it's still around today, is they're going to tax food processors. So for example, your cornflakes that you eat, made by Kellogg's or Post or whoever, that company, Kellogg's or Post, are going to be taxed by the federal government, and the federal government is going to take that money from that business, that company, and they're going to send it down to the farmers, and they're going to say, "Farmer, instead of 200 acres of corn planted a year, which you've usually been doing, we're going to pay you X amount of dollars to plant 100 acres. Bring down the supply of corn, which should bring up the price. There's cash in the farmer's pocket, but then there's also stable prices for farmers' crops." Kind of a win-win, theoretically, right? But now what kind of happens over time, right, and this does stabilize things and it's still around, and this agricultural farm subsidy bills that get passed by Congress are some of the biggest expenditures in the federal budget, creates some inequity generally over time. There are farmers who still go out of business, smaller farmers, and those farmers that go out of business and can't make it, especially because of drought during the 1930s, their farms are sold off for really super cheap. And farmers who are able to buy those things super cheap get more land. And guess what you get if you have more land? You have more acres, you have more access to subsidy dollars. So payment for doing nothing. This was considered to be unconstitutional based on the 10th Amendment, but it was, again, later rewritten. It's still around here yet today. So this is the subsidy program and the subsidy process that is created here. Paying them not to plant crops, inflate farm prices. And the federal government would buy a good amount of food as well. We'll get to that a little bit later. So FDR's response to this is in the second New Deal, his second term in office, to come up with better written laws, right? Things that are more fitting to what a court would approve, so on and so forth, and to structure them differently. And the focus in the second New Deal is more on reform, the reforms that are around here yet today. Social Security, the right to join a union in the Wagner Act, the Fair Labor Standards Act, which gets rid of child labor, sets a minimum wage, limits our work hours per week to 40 hours a week requires overtime pay if you go beyond 40 hours a week. TGIF happens here. Thank God it's Friday, right? And so child labor, as I mentioned before, and limits on who can be employed at what age and how long, many hours a day, that kind of thing come in, which reserves a job for an adult, actually, by having some of this child labor go away and requiring kids to go to school. Imagine that. The second no deal then, therefore, is a lot bolder, it's more aggressive, but it's better written legislation, social welfare programs, stricter controls over businesses. We're looking at these things down here at the bottom. Really, some of the stuff in the recovery category, but most of it's at the bottom. Rules and regulations for banking, industry, support for unions, higher taxes on the rich. Of course, that pays for operating these programs, right? And these new agencies attack unemployment, right? So the other way in which FDR responds to the criticisms of the New Deal is to try and adjust the size of the Supreme Court. This has been talked about just recently here in the last few years of the Trump administration, with him appointing some new court judges to the Supreme Court, right? He rationalizes that we need to add judges because they have too much work. They can't keep up with all of it. We need more judges to take on the workload here that is happening here during this time. The other factor here is that the judges that are on the Supreme Court tend to be more conservative, and they were a bit of a threat to the New Deal. And what he proposes is that there should be a retirement age for the Supreme Court justice to give increased opportunity to replace them, increasing the number from 9 to 15, so a total of 6 new justices. And the reaction to this is going to be pretty strong across the entire public. They're going to say, this seems like you are trying to grab too much power. You're trying to dominate the legislative branch because you have all these Democratic votes, right? There's 2/3 of the Democrats are congressmen are Democrats. And they're wondering if this is really an honest guy. Is he trying to become a dictator? And he just wants to have a bunch of yes people on the Supreme Court that supports him in whatever he wants to do. And then the pendulum of power swings too much toward that one person, the executive, and maybe he becomes something like a king. Well, this had happened before. Congress has the power. It has passed laws and legislation to set the number of Supreme Court justices and create other courts in the past. Has been as high as 10 and been reduced since then, but has been stuck at 9 since about 1869. But this scared some people, right? And so he got a lot of backlash over this, and he couldn't quite go as far as he thought he was going to be able to go. And of course, he said he would take some extra power to wage this war in this emergency. But this was just a little bit too far. So regardless of that, the Supreme Court in the second New Deal, in his second term of office, starts upholding a lot more of his legislation, probably because it was better and more well written, so on and so forth. These are really two very important things. We'll quiz you on that a little bit later. Congress acts in a way in which they help support or encourage the retiring of judges. They vote to increase the retirement pay for judges. That did encourage one person to retire. And so FDR did get a chance to replace one person, but because he serves more than 2 terms in office, we'll get to that more later, he's going to serve and be elected to 4 terms in office. He is going to appoint a total of 8 judges to the Supreme Court. And so that naturally just kind of happens because of people rolling out. And I guess maybe for whatever reason, better pay, tired, that's a lot of judges. Unemployment. There is an improvement in unemployment, right? Here's when the New Deal comes in, right? Right about 1932. It does come down, but in 1937, right, we've got all this pump priming resulting in some relief, but it didn't help us recover. It goes backwards. So why does the unemployment rate go up? Why do things go backwards in 1937? We have another recession in the Great Depression. Social Security taxes started being taken out of people's paychecks and the bank accounts of business and industries. So that was allowing for less spending to occur because it just was going to a government account for people later. There are cuts in spending to balance the budget, and so there were cuts in New Deal programs, and so that reduced spending as well. And unemployment rose significantly. So the response here is that we're going to move toward a new philosophy of spending and economics in government, and that's going to be called Keynesian economics. There's a British economist at about the time, or in the time period, who theorized that economies of nations in the modern times were far too complex, far too big to just let them hopefully come out of things naturally like we come out of a common cold. They have to be dealt with by a central or a federal government with deficit spending in order to stimulate the economy. You have to spend more, you have to borrow in order to put money into an economy to stimulate it again. You have to spend more than you take in tax dollars. So you borrow money. And so FDR announces that we're going to do this at that time, right? And so we go into this huge deficit spending. No, the criticism of this is that if you are going to give this out, people are going to always expect this, right? The sharks are always going to be circling, that kind of thing. This also happened and has happened with every basic administration between FDR and the present time. During the Great Recession of 2008, 2009, there was a significant amount of deficit spending there to get out of that Great Recession. New Deal or Raw Deal, negative aspects of the New Deal. It was causing the federal government to become too big. Governmental elephantiasis, right? Cumbersome, not efficient, difficult, hard to move, that kind of thing. Bureaucracy, government, federal workers, huge in numbers. The federal government becomes the largest employer in the United States, and this also moves the power of the federal government into the advantage, shifting power away from the states. This was the big concern at the Constitutional Convention, remember, way back in the day, 1787. The states are being overpowered. This is going to have an influence on our politics moving forward in the future. A ballooning national debt, right? You can see it here at the Great Depression. Deficit spending here, right? Too much. World War II will send it even higher, but at the Great Depression at the time, it was the highest in our history by a long shot. We can't have this debt. It means higher taxes for future generations and less economic success for those future generations. We're passing it on. Again, here is a 1935 and a 2010 cartoon with a conservative backlash, the Tea Party movement with Obama in 2010. All right. They actually wanted to come up with a constitutional amendment that said the government shall never, ever, except in war, spend more money that takes in taxes, balanced budget. The other factor here is that they argued that this New Deal legislation and these money programs, giving out literally doles of money, handouts of money to people in certain programs, was corrupt. It was just like the political machine. It was involving graft and buying votes from people. It was patronage. It was corrupting the political system, like Boss Tweed and Tammany Hall. Others would argue that, well, it didn't cure the Depression, and certainly it did not, right? And we'll talk about the event that gets us out of that Depression here shortly. There was no reduction or change in the gap between consumption and production. Unemployment was still high during the time period. The other argument here is that it led us closer to something called socialism or a communist state, right? Which we're pretty far away from a communist state, that's for sure. But creeping socialism, if we have one program that allows for federal control over the economy and the flow of goods and resources, then it opens up the door to it being taken a step further later on, right? A planned economy ruins private initiative and things like that. It slows down economic growth is the argument, and eventually we'll get to this communist state. Well, a good example of a real big fear of this happening was the development and creation of the Tennessee Valley Authority. Still around yet today. It was a government agency created to put dams on rivers in the Tennessee Valley River area, which flooded a lot, which was really bad for farmers, but they were going to create hydroelectricity from these dams. Bring electricity to a very impoverished area, create jobs because of it, building it and operating it. And the government would operate those hydroelectric dams, producing electricity at cost, not for profit. So private industry, right, is going to be having a hard time competing with that government-produced electricity, right? So this is displayed in the cartoon here, Jonah, 1938, as in Jonah and the whale. Jonah got swallowed by a great whale, right? And the Tennessee River Valley here, we've got the TVA boat, and FDR is the captain of that boat. And basically it's saying the private-owned power companies have to walk the plank. They are in it for profit. They can't compete with the government and the cheap electricity that they provide. And so they're going to be swallowed up by government ownership of goods. And where will this lead us? This might go to another part of the economy being controlled by the government, and taking away free enterprise out of our economy and free ownership of goods. The other argument here, of course, is that FDR was becoming more like a dictator. His court packing plan was like it. It gave too much power to the presidency, which this is the beginning of what we will call and identify as the imperial presidency. From here on, the executive power of the president gets much greater, and that happens with our world wars and the Cold War and things like that. Whenever there's a national emergency, the presidents become more powerful, and notice the king's crown there. Supporters, it provided relief to the needy. No one starved. FDR said no one's going to starve, although there were people who were going hungry, and no one did starve really. Any directly, I guess you would say. But the federal government does buy up surplus food and offers things like food stamps. If you got a food stamp and you qualified for it, you get any grocery item or certain grocery items, but depending on the color of your stamp. Children were given incredibly cheap meals in schools. Free and reduced lunches is connected to that and has its beginnings here. The workers who provided it were employed by the Works Progress Administration, right? And so that was one of the problems of the time period, that there was plenty, but not everybody was getting access to the plenty. It is unbelievable that irony existed. So the government stepped in and said, we're not going to allow that to happen. At least for that period of time. It averted the collapse and prevented the collapse of capitalism. Proponents and supporters would argue that the problem wasn't capitalism, but it was the capitalists. It's the humans operating within it, and that the humans within it needed rules and regulations to balance things out for other people. And so in this way, the more radical communist, radical socialist agenda and voices were kind of drowned out and didn't have the following as much, because there were some reforms and checks on the powers that be and the inequities in the system. American Socialist Party had said the New Deal killed the socialist movement, right? Took the thunder away from them and those particular parties. Kind of like the Democratic Party, by nominating William Jennings Bryan, kind of took the thunder away from the populism, took on some of their ideas and ran with them, but the Populist Party didn't swallow it up, right? It would have been perhaps maybe a little more radical, especially, I guess, if William Jennings Bryan would have been elected president. William Jennings Bryan talking about a lot of the things that are happening here in the New Deal. So other supporters would say there was reform, but no bloody revolution. Right? Democracy survived. In other parts of the world, Europe and in Asia, Japan, they turned to dictators. They turned to totalitarian systems of government, right? And this was the trend in the time period. The FDR's New Deal also restored U.S. pride. It did put people to work. It got people moving. And with movement and doing things, there was a more positive mood and outlook and improved psychology in the country because of all that. All right. In the end, he's criticized by everybody on both sides. Conservatives say he went too far. The left said he didn't go far enough. Events, really, though, what changes things, what gets us out of the Depression is this thing overseas called World War II. That's when unemployment starts to drop, and it's right about here that we gradually start supplying resources, war materials to the Allies who are trying to fight off Adolf Hitler. The New Deal was basically Tylenol, pain relief, didn't help with the recovery really, but World War II does. Where we're going out with this a little bit later on in the future, in the 1960s, the New Deal is going to be continued on with the Great Society programs, Medicare, Medicaid, that kind of thing. It's going to dwarf whatever we have here in the New Deal. And you got those things linked up from where we've been to where we're going. There's your snap chart, left-hand side. Have a great day. Keep making hay.